Have you heard of the mosaic strategy? It's the strategy the IRGC used and is currently implementing in their fight against the US, and is basically another fancier term for decentralized command and control. Because once we knocked out their communications, they had pre existing orders that they had to follow through, regardless of getting any approval from the higher ups, because they knew this was going to be a war of survivability. What this also tells us, though, is that they had always planned to strike their neighbors. And I hope people understand that they didn't do that out of any kind of death throes or any kind of loss of communication. It was always part of their plan, because they had predetermined orders in hand, and if they were not able to get any confirmation, they were to continue as planned. So they had always planned to attack their neighbors. Why? Because they knew that this wasn't like the wars of the past. This was a war of survivability, and that's exactly what it has turned into. And so, despite all of the losses the IRGC has suffered, we're over 20,000 targets lost, their leadership lost, their Air Force is gone, their Navy is almost entirely obliterated, many of their ballistic missile capability is almost entirely obliterated, their energy sectors, their resource capabilities are getting degraded. Even after all of that, people are still saying that this is the Iran trap, that the IRGC is doing better than what is being told to you, and that America is going to lose. And the new hope of the anti-American pro-IRGC cheerleaders are saying is that this will be a war that is too costly for the U.S. and that eventually the world will turn against them, and that the U.S. will be forced to not only accept a ceasefire, but also to pull out of the Middle East. And the reason why that's never going to happen is, of course, because of oil, but more importantly, because it can only be extracted through the one pivotal point of the Strait of Hormuz. And honestly, what's going to end up happening is the world is going to see why Iran, or rather the IRGC, needs to be crushed. Imagine if the war had never started and Iran was able to continue down its path towards the development of a nuclear weapon, which by all metrics they were doing, despite what all the naysayers want you to believe. They kept moving the goalpost ever so closer to the end zone while still saying that they aren't actually trying to accomplish this goal. On top of that, they would have retained their ballistic missile capabilities, thousands and thousands of them, and increased in their capabilities and ranges. On top of that, they would have developed more and more drones, so much that we wouldn't be able to handle. And so at some point, maybe in 2035, they eventually get their nuclear weapon, maybe even a dozen. And then at that point, they have a ballistic missile and drone shield defense, counter-offense capability that is so overwhelming that they now get to dictate terms to the entire world with regards to energy. As the Strait of Hormuz controls 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply and is a main artery of the global economy. Well, that world can never, ever be allowed to exist. And I think we're seeing that unfold in real time, as even the mere threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz is causing such economic turmoil, even when they are completely degraded and incapable of conducting any kind of conventional counteroffense. And now we are seeing a regime of survivability unfold with asymmetric warfare. And so the world is starting to see that they have no choice but to go against the IRGC. Even their allies have abstained with supporting them. And the IRGC are basically completely alone in this fight of survivability. Because despite the fact that they still have a degraded drone capability and degraded counter-offense capability to a smaller scale, they are going to suffer something far worse, and that's going to be starvation and lack of water. People don't seem to remember, but they were already facing a severe drought going into this, and now that their energy resources are completely being degraded, maybe even depleted, their food resources are also going to become quite scarce. And so while they may be looking strong now in the eyes of the media in the counteroffense terms with regards to their strikes on oil and cargo ships and their rhetoric, we are only less than 3 weeks into this. And so there are only 3 realistic outcomes with regards to this war. One is, and of course this is kind of the worst case scenario, where the IRGC still retains some semblance of power and authority over the country, but they eventually capitulate and a very weak ceasefire and peace is drawn out, and they slowly but surely over the next generation build up their forces again, leaving it to future generations and future presidents to deal with, but they bring the global economy back to a reasonable peace. Another possible outcome is the IRGC actually loses, and through various political mechanisms, the Shah is eventually established as an interim leader while they usher in a new democratic government, which is obviously everyone's hopeful outcome. And then a third outcome is that Iran is bedeviled by multiple interest groups in the area, and they kind of collapse into a quasi civil war as they all try to gain some sort of semblance of control. While in the meantime, either the Board of Peace or the United Nations or a coalition of forces retains control over the Strait of Hormuz in order to allow for the free flow of oil and other goods. Now, I'm not putting any weight behind any of those three outcomes other than the fact that those are the most realistic ones. The most unrealistic outcome that will never materialize is a U.S. pullback out of the Middle East. And anybody saying that honestly doesn't know what they're talking about.